Hi, everybody. We are joined today by Dr. Kent Redford, Principal of Consulting. Mr. Redford has been and currently working on numerous projects specifically towards environmental conservation, including spearheading a task force and technical working group for IUCN to analyze the impending intersection between conservation and synthetic biology. And thank you, Mr. Redford, for joining us today. So our first question for you, could you let our listeners know about your expertise and what kinds of projects you do in the field of nature conservation?
So I was trained as an ecologist. I did my early work on mammals of South America in particular. I then became interested in uses of resources by traditional peoples, particularly indigenous peoples in the Amazon. So I was at the University of Florida for 10 years doing that research, and also with colleagues setting up and running two interdisciplinary graduate training programs focused on the tropics and on conservation resource use. I then left academia and spent 14 years in the non-governmental organization of the Nature Conservancy and then the Wildlife Conservation Society. And there I worked on a variety of issues involving the conservation of species, particularly mammals and birds, and protected areas, the establishment and management of protected areas. While I was at the Wildlife Conservation Society, I also spent a few years also working on issues concerning the management of captive species, because WCS manages 4 New York City zoos in the aquarium. So after that, after those 14 years, I left the NGO world, and my wife and I moved to Portland, Maine, in the far northeastern corner of the United States. And I have been here for 8 years, working with an organization I established called Archipelago Consulting. And it's in that guise that I worked on this synthetic biology and conservation issue to which you just referred, and that I think we'll be concentrating on. But I have also done a variety of other things during that time, including a focus on privately protected areas around the world, on invasive species, and the U.S. National Park Service's strategy for managing them, and most recently with a global environment facility working on their post-COVID environmental strategy.
On the note of synthetic biology, could you then please introduce to us synthetic biology, and how has synthetic biology been applied in nature conservation?
So synthetic biology is a collective term for an evolving set of technologies which allow humans to make very precise changes in the DNA, the genes, and the genomes of organisms, other organisms, well, including humans, in order to achieve desired outcomes. And the early versions of these tools are what brought humanity genetically modified organisms, GMOs, which were made, produced, particularly in agriculture. And they were a set of, at that point, what we would now call primitive tools, which have now evolved to be much more precise. But agriculture remains one of the principal areas in which these tools are being applied. These changes involve changes to everything ranging from individual base pairs within the DNA sequence, one of the 4 base pairs, all the way to introducing genetic material from other species, and all the way to actually creating novel base pairs which have never existed in the history of life, at least life on Earth. So, and that's just the beginning. So the CRISPR-Cas9 is a technology that many people will have heard of. It is one of the tools that is used to effect these changes. It turns out that it's only one in a whole variety of different CRISPRs that are being applied. And these technologies are what were made possible the production of 2 of the, certainly in the US and in Europe, 2 of the most commonly applied COVID vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. So many of us have have very immediate personal reasons to benefit from the application of these technologies. So in 2012, I realized that this was a set of technologies that was inevitably going to be intersecting with the natural world and with conservation. So it involves everything from wastewater coming from sanitation systems that would be containing these modifications to crops and pollinators and pests and what have you flying between relatively wild ecosystems and fields. And so I put together a meeting that was held in 2013 in the UK, which was the first time we brought together the conservation community and the synthetic biology community to discuss these issues. That then led to an invitation from IUCN to put together and run a task force, which ran 5 years and only finished in mid-September of this year. One other thing. And then with my colleague, Bill Adams, who was one of the three of us who put together this Cambridge meeting, we recently published a book called Strange Natures, looking at the role of synthetic biology in relationship to nature conservation.
What are the specific applications of this technology in the nature conservation realm? And what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced while trying to implement this technology for nature conservation?
Okay, so good questions. The first thing to say is that there have been no applications of this technology, to my knowledge, that have actually proceeded so far as to be released into the wild for conservation purposes. The majority of the applications of the technologies have taken place in industrial settings where algae or bacteria have been modified to produce low volume, high value chemicals like scents and flavorings, and more a bit in the human body. And in agriculture, we're beginning to see the early wild releases of genetically modified organisms connected with pest control. And in public health, particularly associated with mosquito-borne diseases, but certainly mosquitoes have been modified using some of these technologies, have been released by the billions or in different countries in the world. So back to conservation, though, there has been a lot of interest and research. Much of it hasn't even proceeded to the laboratory, though some of it has. So the places that interest people are in direct applications and in indirect applications. So direct applications would include altering the genomes of an organism to allow it to survive some threat, say climate change. So an example of this, there's quite a lot of work that's been going on to think about genetically modifying coral or the microorganisms that help make coral what it is in order to allow coral to survive warming oceans, warming and acidifying oceans. But that hasn't actually been released yet. So that's an example of a direct application. The indirect applications have to do with things like modifying other organisms to release, to diminish the threats to the conservation targets. So this might involve altering pest organisms, be they plant or animal, in order to decrease the threat that they are having to the target species. Or the one that has been most talked about is altering invasive house mice in order to decrease their predation on endangered seabirds on oceanic islands. So the biggest impediment has been social and political. That is, there are a set of people who are convinced that even the serious contemplation of the application of these technologies to anything, but particularly conservation, are dangerous and should be outlawed, forbidden. And they are very pugnacious and effective politically and in providing messages. And they have been lobbying across a broad variety of stages to try and get the global community to either prohibit or at least severely limit any development, let alone application of these tools. I don't wish to make this comparison lightly, but there is a worthwhile comparator in the anti-vaccine movement, which has shown up for a variety of different reasons around the world in different guises in different countries. And they're not dissimilar in the sense that they believe, well, the arguments are based on similar distrusts about science and about those who decide on, fund, and implement that science.
Thank you for giving us an understanding of the challenges facing with synthetic biology and also the comparisons with the vaccine movement. I think it's really helped us understand that there are people out there that are resistant to this type of technology. Since we are students in studying international relations, law, and development studies. And so how do you think we can improve the synergy between innovation and implementing them in policies and practices?
Conservation, I would say, as a whole, has been technophobic. There is an amazing book that was written about the role of robots in classical Greece. And I had no idea that the Greeks were very interested in the question of robots that occurred in their myths, but also in stories, and people actually worked on making robots. And there was a long line of thinking that asked what the difference was between robots and humans. And the author of this book argues that the important distinction between that which is made and that which is born. And I think that many people have that as a kind of rough default idea of what technology is. So it isn't nature, it's something humans made. It's a drone, it's a digital camera, it's a satellite, and we're okay with that. So the synthetic biology, by its very definition, is a hybrid between what is made and what is born. And the distinction, the lack of clarity between these two categories, I have found in 9 years of talking to people, is deeply disturbing. And the comparators that my audience have used when they're first exposed to synthetic biology as a field are most commonly either the film Jurassic Park or the novel Frankenstein. And so people, it's a very common thing for people to raise a hand after a presentation I've given and say, I can't believe that you would ever be thinking about the application of synthetic biology. Haven't you either seen Jurassic Park or B, read Frankenstein? So first I kind of bridled at these, and now I become really interested in that because, and what I say in return to them is, do you appreciate the fact that both of those are works of fiction? And what does that mean for us as humans, that as we consider a powerful, both for good and potentially bad technology like synthetic biology, that the framing for our concern comes from the imaginations of brilliant authors and filmmakers? And I think it demands that as you young people consider going into this field, that you stop thinking that you shouldn't be understanding fiction and the role that it plays. You know, the difference between what is true and not true has been lost, just as the difference between what is born and what is made has been lost. And it means you guys are out in a world in which the distinctions that somebody like me, who's 66 now, the distinctions that were just unquestioned as part of my education are now under question. And that's the world you're entering and propose to working in. So, and it doesn't matter when I get engaged in with discussions with people about this topic, if they are virulently against the application, they will summon a different set of facts than those that are virulently in favor. And the sorting out as to which is which has become an intensely political process. It's no longer the role of scientists to say, well, we did the statistical analysis and I can say without question that it is this, right? No, everybody's an expert now.
Yes. I guess to end our podcast, we wanted to kind of just bring it to a more general discussion on your end of what you think the role the general public and civil society should play within nature conservation? And this is a broad question. We just thought that this could be something to impart to our viewers of the podcast, like any words of advice you have.
So the application of technology, used to be much more straightforward than it is anymore. And God bless you. That's why I'm more than happy to spend time talking to you, because you're going to be carrying this on long after whatever I'm going to be doing after I'm done. And these things are going to be super important to take into consideration. We need the human imagination to be unleashed more than scientists and technicians want to do. So my future interest is in working in science and story rather than in doing anything detailed, because the fact that the three of you, three young women from around the world, are attending the program that you're attending and are interested in the topics you are interested in, and went to the trouble of reaching out to me and behaving so professionally, is one of the most encouraging things that's happened to me in quite a long time. So thank you for that.